This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Are you a fan of spine-chilling tales of the unexplained? If so, get ready for an exciting new podcast experience, Chillers and Thrillers. Immerse yourself in the world of the paranormal as I, your host, narrate true stories about people's hair-raising encounters with ghosts, demons, and other eerie phenomena. In Chillers and Thrillers, I'm dedicated to bringing you authentic, bone-chilling accounts without any comedic elements or skepticism. So dim the lights, leave your skepticism behind, and settle in comfortably for our bi-monthly episodes, available on your favorite podcast platforms.
Have you ever been listening to a creepy ghost story or haunting history, and you're like, damn, this is so enjoyable, but I wish my friends were here so we could experience it together? That's us. We're your girls, and we'll bring the snacks when you join us on I Scream, You Scream, the podcast where we serve up chilling stories with a side of our favorite ice cream.
Every month, we pick a new flavor of ice cream and a new topic to go along with it. Werewolves, poison, cemeteries, you name it. From deep dives into stories we all thought we knew to your real-world experiences, at this ice cream party, we always get to the bottom of the bowl.
Cozy up with us every Tuesday for your weekly scoop of the most chilling histories, mysteries, and paranormal perplexities. Until then, keep it cool.
And keep it creepy.
Thanks for listening to the Red Treehouse, where I tell you scary stories to keep you up at night. You can listen to the Red Treehouse wherever you stream podcasts. Just be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Oh, and leave a 5-star review. You can follow the Red Treehouse on social media, on Threads and Instagram, at Red Treehouse Pod. And the Red Treehouse is on Patreon, where by joining even for free, you receive exclusive member benefits. Simply go to patreon.com/Red Treehouse. The Red Treehouse is dedicated to my dad. I love you, Pop. In this episode of the Red Treehouse, I'm going to share 2 classic horror stories, The Golden Bracelet and Mountain of Souls, written by Gustavo Adolfo Becquer, who is widely considered to be the Spanish Poe. These stories are thematically rich and thought-provoking, and they're guaranteed to keep you up at night. So sit back, turn down the lights, pull up the covers, and pay close attention as I read The Golden Bracelet and Mountain of Souls. I'm your host, Will. Welcome to the Red Treehouse. The Golden Bracelet. She was beautiful. Beautiful with the kind of beauty that inspires vertigo. With a beauty that is nothing like that which we associate with angels, but which nevertheless seems supernatural. A diabolical beauty which the devil might have given to someone to make them his instrument on earth. He loved her. He loved her with a love that knows no limits or restraints. He loved her with a love that looks for happiness and joy, but finds only torment. A love that seems to be happy, but which heaven might have used as punishment for a sin. She was capricious, capricious and extravagant like all women. He was superstitious and bold, like all men of his time. Her name was Maria Atúñez. His was Pedro Alfonso de Orellana. They were both from Toledo, where they had lived since they were born. The events described in this remarkable story, which occurred many years ago, do not tell us anything more about these two protagonists. In my capacity as a true-to-life chronicler, I will not add a single word of my own invention to make them seem better. Chapter 2. One day he found her in tears and asked her why she was crying. After she dried her eyes, she looked at him intently for a moment. Then she sighed and began crying again. Moving closer to Maria, Pedro took her hand and, resting his arm on the railing of the bridge from which she was looking down at the passing waters, he asked her again why she was crying. Below their vantage point, the Tajo was flowing around the rocks which formed the seat of this imperial city. The sun was setting behind the nearby mountains. The fog was floating like a blue veil over the water, and only the monotonous sound of the current broke the profound silence. Maria protested. "Don't ask me why I'm crying. Don't ask me because I can't tell you, and if I tried, you wouldn't understand me." Sometimes there are desires that fill the heart of a woman that are only revealed by a sigh. Bizarre ideas that spread through our imagination which we don't dare to mention. Incomprehensible aspects of our feminine nature that a man could never conceive. I beg you, don't ask me the cause of my sorrow. If I were to tell you, you would only respond with laughter. As she stopped speaking, she bowed her head again. Still not satisfied, he continued pressing her with questions. Eventually, she broke her stubborn silence, and she said to her lover with a voice that was reluctant and hesitating, "All right, you asked for it, but it's so crazy it will make you laugh. But I don't care. If that is what you want, then I'll tell you. Yesterday, I went to the cathedral. They were celebrating the Festival of the Virgin, and resting on the central altar over a golden base, her statue was shining like it was on fire. Powerful notes of the organ spread through all the corners of the church while the choir was singing Hail Holy Queen. I was praying and my mind was thinking religious thoughts when I automatically raised my head and looked at the altar. For some reason, I don't know why, my eyes fixed on the statue. No, that's not correct. Not the statue. They were fixed on an object I had never seen before. An object that, for some strange reason, captured my attention. Don't laugh. That object was the golden bracelet that the Mother of God was wearing on her arm while holding her divine son. I looked away and started praying again, but that was impossible. My eyes involuntarily went back to the same place. The lights of the altar were reflected in the facets of its diamonds in a way that captivated me. Thousands of red, blue, and green sparks glittered over its gems like tiny bits of fire, like a dizzying ring of fire spirits that fascinated me with their glow and their incredible agitation. I left the church and came home, but I came with that image fixed in my mind. I lay down, but I couldn't sleep. With that thought fixed in my mind, the night seemed endless. Finally, at dawn my eyes closed and, would you believe, even in my dreams, appearing and disappearing again and again, I saw a woman. A beautiful, dark-skinned woman wearing jewels and precious stones. Yes, it was a woman, but not like the Virgin whom I adore, and before whom I bow. It was another woman like me, who looked at me and laughed as though she mocked me. "Do you see it?" she seemed to say as she showed me her jewel. "See how it shines. It looks like a circle of stars plucked from a summer night. Do you see it? But it is not yours, and it will never, ever be yours. Perhaps you could have other jewels that seem nicer and more precious, if that were ever possible. But this one that glows in a way that seems so fascinating. Never, never." I woke up, and I had the same idea as before, undoubtedly inspired by Satan, fixed in my mind like a burning nail. So what do you say? Are you just going to bow your head in silence? Aren't you going to laugh at my madness?" With a convulsive movement, Pedro gripped the hilt of his sword and raised his head, which in fact he had lowered. And with a hesitant voice he asked, "Which virgin has that jewel?" "The one of the tabernacle." "Of the tabernacle?" the young man said, his voice filled with dismay. "The virgin of the tabernacle?" And for a moment his face seemed to show the reflection of a terrible idea that had just entered his mind. "Oh, why couldn't it have been some other virgin?" he asked, bursting with emotion. "Why couldn't it have been the jewel that the archbishop has on his mitre, that the king has on his crown, or the devil in his claws? If that were the case, I would be happy to find a way to get it and give it to you, though it cost me my life or caused my damnation. But the Virgin of the Tabernacle, the Virgin who is our patron saint, and I who have been born in Toledo, no, never. Yes, never," Maria murmured with a voice that was barely audible. "Never." And she continued crying. Pedro looked down at the waters of the Tajo with a glum expression, his eyes fixed on the current that continued to flow past their vantage point, past the rocks which formed the foundation of their city. 3. The Cathedral of Toledo. Imagine a forest of granite palm trees whose branches form a magnificent arrangement of arches, under which a whole world of real and imaginary creatures are thriving with the life that was granted by a god. Imagine an incomprehensible mixture of shadow and light, where the nave spread out under vaulted arches that are sunken in the darkness of a sanctuary that is permeated with the glow of candles. Imagine a world of stone as large as the spirit of our religion, which is as somber as its laws, as enigmatic as its parables, and you will still not have the slightest idea of the magnificence, the power, and the faith of our elders who for centuries have filled it with the treasure of their belief, their inspiration, and their art. In its bosom you will find the stillness, the majesty, and the poetry of mysticism, as well as a sacred rejection of all mundane thoughts and the petty passions of everyday life. Material appetites are satisfied by inhaling fresh air from the mountains. Atheism must be cured by breathing its atmosphere of faith. But if the cathedral always seems grand and imposing when we enter its mysterious holy sanctuary, it is never quite as impressive as on the days when it is decorated for a religious festival, when its tabernacles are covered with gold and jewelry, its steps with carpets, and its pillars with tapestries. Then, when thousands of silver lamps emit streams of light, when a cloud of incense floats in the air, when the voices of the chorus, the harmony of the organ, and the bells of the tower shake the building from its deepest foundations to its highest steeples, that is when, on hearing this, one realizes God is present in the cathedral and that He animates it with His breath and fills it with the reflection of His divine omnipotence. On the same day when the conversation which we have just described took place, in the Cathedral of Toledo, they were celebrating the last magnificent octave of the Virgin. This important religious festival had attracted large numbers of the faithful. The crowds of people had dispersed in different directions. The lights of the chapel and the altar were extinguished, and the enormous doors had creaked on their hinges as they closed, when a very pale man, as pale as the statue of the tomb where he kneeled for a moment, made his way quietly and cautiously through the shadows towards the iron gate of the transept. There, the light of the lamp made it possible to distinguish his features. It was Pedro. What could have happened between the two lovers so that he was now bold enough to attempt something which earlier, just to think about it, had made his hair stand on end? We will never know. But there he was, and he was undoubtedly there in order to carry out a criminal act. In his nervous glances, in his trembling knees, in the sweat that was running down his forehead, one could read the thought that was in his mind. The cathedral was now empty, completely empty and sunken in profound silence. Nevertheless, from time to time, Pedro could hear some strange noises, maybe the wood creaking, or gusts of wind, or who knows what it was. Perhaps it was the product of an imagination that, in its excitement, hears things which are not there. But even then, sometimes nearby, sometimes far away, sometimes behind his back and then at his side, there were sounds like repressed sobs, like the sound of cloth rubbing, like the noise of steps that ceaselessly come and go. Pedro tried to keep moving. He arrived at the gate and climbed to the first step of the main chapel. Around this chapel were tombs with the stone image of former kings, who, with their hand resting on the hilt of their sword, seemed to watch over the sanctuary in whose dark shadows they were resting for eternity. "Keep going," Pedro said to himself. He attempted to move, but could not. When he looked down, his hair raised on end again. He saw in dismay that the floor of the chapel was formed with stone slabs that were covering several tombs. For a moment, it seemed that a cold, skeletal hand was pushing him back with an irresistible force. The dying lamps that flickered in the darkness, like stars lost in the shadows, made his vision waver so that everything seemed to fluctuate. The statues on the tombs and images on the altar seemed to shimmer, and the entire church, with its arches and stone buttresses, seemed to wink in and out. "Go on," Pedro repeated angrily, and he finally moved toward the altar. By climbing up on it, he was able to reach the base of the image. Around him, everything was unreal and frightening. Objects were indistinct and difficult to see in the darkness. Only the Queen of Heaven, dimly lit by the glow of a golden lamp, was smiling calmly, quiet and serene, in the midst of all this horror. However, the silent and motionless smile, which calmed him for a moment, began to fill him with an indescribable feeling of terror, a terror that was deeper than anything he had felt before. Nevertheless, he took control of himself and closed his eyes so that he would not see it. He reached out his hand and convulsively pulled off the bracelet, the golden bracelet which had been the pious gift of a former archbishop and was worth a fortune. Now the precious thing was in his possession. His tense fingers held onto it with a power that was almost supernatural. Now all he had to do was flee and carry it away. But in order to do that, he would first have to open his eyes, and Pedro was afraid to see. He was afraid to see the statue, the tombs of the kings, and the gargoyles of the cornices, the mythical monsters resting on the columns, and the faint rays of light that were moving like ghosts through the naves, which were filled with strange, frightening noises. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked around, and a sharp cry escaped from his lips. The cathedral was filled with statues dressed in long robes that had descended from their niches and their pedestals so they filled the entire cathedral and were staring at him with their empty eyes. Saints, monks, priests, angels, devils, warriors, ladies, and acolytes were now gathered around him, occupying the naves and the altars. At his feet, next to the kings who were kneeling over their tombs, were the marble archbishops that he had seen before lying motionless on their deathbeds, while slithering over the slabs, climbing up the columns, perched on the arches, and hanging from the ceiling like worms in an immense cadaver, a multitude of reptiles and creatures of granite were swarming. He could bear it no longer. His heart felt like it was going to explode, and a wave of blood clouded his vision. He shouted for a second time, a piercing shout of abject terror, and he collapsed on the altar. The next morning, when the church workers found him, he was still holding the golden bracelet in his hands, and when he saw them, he exclaimed with an insane laugh, "It's hers! It's hers!" The poor fellow was mad. Mountain of Souls. On the night of All Souls' Day, I was awakened by the sound of church bells ringing. The sound of their constant monotonous tolling reminded me of a story I heard not long ago in Soria. I tried to go back to sleep, but that was not possible. Once your imagination is roused, it is like a runaway horse, and no matter how hard you try, you can never rein it in. So I gave in and decided to write it down, which is what I am doing now. At 2 a.m, after an early breakfast, with a cigarette in my mouth, I am thinking that it would probably not be of much interest to readers of El Contemporáneo. I heard this story in the city where the events took place, and as I wrote, I turned my head from time to time whenever I heard my balcony windows rattle in the cold night wind. So for whatever it is worth, here goes, like a horse without a bridle. 1. Tie up the hounds and blow the horn so the hunters will know it's time to come back and return to town. It's beginning to get dark. This is All Souls Day, and we are on the Mountain of Souls. So soon. If it were any other day, I would not wait to kill this herd of wolves that the blizzards of Mount Moncayo have driven from their dens. But today, that is impossible. Very soon it will be time for prayers, and the souls of the dead will start ringing their bell in the chapel on the mountain. In that ruined chapel? Come on, are you trying to frighten me? No, dear cousin. You are not familiar with the things in this country, since you have come here from somewhere else. Rein in your mare, and I will ride with you so I can tell you about it during the rest of our journey. The travelers gathered in boisterous, happy groups. The Counts of Borges and Alcudiel mounted their magnificent steeds and hurried after their children, Beatrice and Alonso, who had ridden ahead of the retinue. During the remainder of the journey, Alonso repeated the following story. This mountain once belonged to the Templars, whose monastery you can see on the banks of the river. The Templars were both soldiers and members of a religious order. When the city of Soria was reconquered from the Moors, the king asked them to come from a distant land to serve as defenders of the city, which was an offense to the nobles of Castile, who wanted to protect it by themselves, just as they had reconquered it alone. Between the knights of this new and powerful order and the nobles of the city, there was a deep hatred that fermented for several years, and finally exploded. The Templars had closed off the mountain, where game was plentiful, and used it for hunting and to amuse themselves. But the nobles were determined to stage a hunt on the mountain, in spite of the prohibition of the monks with spurs, as they called their enemies. The news of this challenge spread, and there was nothing that could deter the latter from their decision to hunt, or the former from their determination to prevent it. So the plan of the nobles was carried out. Wild beasts do not remember it. Only mothers who mourn for their children still think about it. It was not a hunt, it was a bloody battle, and the mountain was littered with corpses, so that the wolves they had tried to exterminate had a marvelous feast. Finally, the king intervened, and by his order the mountain, which had been the scene of this terrible disaster, was abandoned, and the chapel of the knights, where both Templars and nobles were buried, began to fall into ruins. Since that time, they say that on the night of All Souls Day, one can hear the sound of the bell in the chapel, and one can see the souls of the dead, still wrapped in their shrouds, wandering through the thistles and the brambles, as though they were engaged in some strange hunting party. Deer run away in fear, wolves howl, snakes hiss, and the following day, one can see skeletal footprints in the snow. That is why we call it the Mountain of Souls, and that is why I wanted to leave it now, before night falls. Alonso's story ended at the point where they reached the bridge that leads to the city. There, they waited for the rest of the retinue, which after it joined the two young people, entered the dark and narrow streets of Soria. 2. The servants had finished removing the cloaks. The tall Gothic fireplace of the palace of the Count of Alcudiel cast a bright glow illuminating the group of noble men and women who were gathered before it, chatting familiarly, and above them the wind rattled the high arched windows of the hall. Only two people seemed to be uninterested in the conversation: Beatrice and Alonso. Beatrice stared at the fire while lost in thought. Alonso kept looking at the sparks from the red flames that were reflected in the blue eyes of Beatrice. Both had been silent for some time. When they discussed the night of All Souls Day, the people mentioned fearful tales in which ghosts and witches play a leading role, while the church bells of Soria kept ringing monotonously and sorrowfully. "Dear cousin," said Alonso, finally breaking their long silence, "soon we will have to say goodbye, perhaps for good. I know that you are not fond of the arid plains of Castile, its crude customs and its people, its simple, patriarchal dress. At times I have heard you sigh, perhaps for some attractive young man from your homeland. Beatrice shrugged her shoulders with an expression of cold indifference, and her entire feminine character was revealed in the scornful contraction of her thin lips. Or perhaps it is because of the splendor of the French court where you used to live, the young man hastened to add. I can see that, in one way or the other, you will not wait long to leave. But when you do, I would like you to have something to remember me. Do you remember the day we went to the church to give thanks to God because you had regained the health for which you had come to this land? The jeweled brooch attached to the feather on my hat caught your attention. I was thinking how nice it would look if you were fastening the veil that covers your dark hair. It once belonged to a bride. My father gave it to the one who gave birth to me, and she carried it to the altar. Would you like to have it? I don't know how things are done in your country, the young woman replied. But in mine, when you receive a gift like this, it implies a commitment. Only on the day of a ceremony should you ever accept a gift from a relative, who may or may not expect something in return. The coldness with which Beatrice said these words troubled the youth for a moment, but after calming himself, he said sadly, I know, cousin, but we are celebrating All Souls' Day, which is also your Saint's Day. Since today is a day of ceremonies and gifts, would you accept mine? Beatrice bit her lip and extended her hand to take the jewel, without saying a word. The two young people became silent again, and once again it was possible to hear the broken voices of the old women who were still speaking of witches and ghosts, while the wind shook the high arched windows and was accompanied by the constant monotonous ringing of the bells. After a few moments, the interrupted dialogue was resumed. And before the end of All Souls' Day, when both of us are celebrating our Saint's Day, you could, without making any commitment, also give me something to remember you, couldn't you? Alonso said as he fixed his eyes on those of his cousin that began to shine, as though illuminated by some diabolical idea. Yes, why not? She said, raising her hand to her right shoulder, as though she was searching for something in the folds of her velvet cloak, which was trimmed with gold. Then, with an expression of sadness, she added, Do you remember the blue sash I wore while we were hunting, and which for some reason, I'm not sure why, you said there was something about its color that was the image of your soul? Yes. Well, unfortunately I lost it. I was thinking of giving it to you as a remembrance, but now it is lost. You lost it? But where? Alonso asked, rising out of his chair with an indescribable expression of fear and hope. I don't know. Probably on the mountain. On the Mountain of Souls, he whispered, turning pale, while letting himself fall back into his chair. On the Mountain of Souls, he repeated, and then he continued with an unsure and faltering voice. You know, because you must have heard it 1,000 times. In this city and all over Castile, they call me the King of the Hunters. Since I have not been able to prove myself in battle like my ancestors, I have devoted all the energy of my youth and all the hereditary spirit of my race to this pastime, which can also be a kind of war. The carpet on which your feet are resting has been made from the remains of beasts killed by my hand. I know their haunts and their customs. I have fought them both day and night, on foot and horseback, alone and with a hunting party, and no one has ever seen me flee from danger at any time. On any other night, I would gladly search for that sash, and I would do so joyfully as a challenge. But on this night, why hide it from you? I would be afraid. Can you hear that? The bells are ringing. Prayers have begun in the church on San Juan del Duero, and the souls on the mountains will now be raising their yellowed skulls out of the thickets which cover their graves. The souls, whose very sight can freeze the blood of the most courageous, and can turn his hair white, or carry him off in a wild race, like a leaf that is caught in a storm without knowing where it will fall. While the young man was speaking, an imperceptible smile spread over the lips of Beatrice, who, when he had finished, said with an air of indifference, as she stared at the fire where the flames jumped and the wood crackled, while throwing off sparks of many different colors. Oh, in no way. What madness! To go back to the mountain for such a trivial thing. On such a dark night, on All Souls' Night, when the paths might be filled with wolves. When she uttered this last phrase, it was in such a way that Alonso could not help but recognize the bitter irony. As though propelled by a string, he jumped up and rubbed his hand over his brow like he was trying to wipe away the fear that was only in his head, but not his heart. Then, with a firm voice, he said to his beautiful cousin, who was still staring at the hearth and watching the dancing flames, "Goodbye, Beatrice, goodbye. I will see you later." "Alonso! Alonso!" Beatrice shouted, turning rapidly, but though she tried or seemed to try to stop him, the young man had already disappeared. Shortly after that, the sound of a horse was heard as it galloped off in the distance. The lovely young woman, with a radiant expression of satisfaction coloring her cheeks, listened attentively to the sound of the horse that grew weaker and weaker, until it finally disappeared completely. Meanwhile, the old women continued repeating their tales of souls who come back from the dead, while the wind rattled the windows and bells rang in the distance. 3. An hour, then 2, then 3 had passed. The clock was about to strike midnight when Beatrice finally withdrew to her room. Alonso still had not returned, in spite of the fact that it should have taken him no more than an hour to return from the mountain. Oh, his fear must have slowed him, the young woman exclaimed. Closing the book she had been reading, she climbed into bed and tried in vain to say some of the prayers which the church devoted to All Souls' Day. She finally was able to sleep, but her sleep was restless, light, and nervous. The clock on the gate struck 12. In her dreams, Beatrice felt the constant vibration of the bells until she opened her eyes. It seemed as though she had heard the sound of her name, but it came from far away, very far, from a voice that was labored and suffering. The sound of the wind was coming through the windows. Yes, it was probably just the wind, she said, putting her hand over her heart in an effort to calm her nerves. But her heart kept beating even more rapidly, and the oaken doors of her house began to creak on their hinges with a prolonged and strident sound. First it was one door, then it was others that were closer and closer, until all of the doors that led to her room creaked, one after the other. And the sound they produced was a noise that was nerve-wracking and filled her with fear. Afterward, there was a silence which was filled with the strange sounds of midnight, the distant barking of dogs, confused voices saying many unintelligible words, echoes of footsteps coming and going, rustling of cloth as though it were dragged over the ground, sighs that were choked off, labored breathing which was barely audible, and a mysterious shaking that announced the presence of something that was unseen, but whose approach was still noticeable in the darkness. Trembling with fear, Beatrice stuck her head through the windows surrounding her bed and listened for a moment. She heard a variety of different sounds. She wiped her hand over her brow and listened again, and this time there was nothing but silence. However, out of the corner of an eye, in the midst of a nervous crisis, she could see that there were elusive shapes moving around her. But when she looked directly at them, there was nothing but darkness and opaque shadows. "Ah!" she exclaimed, once again resting her head on the blue satin pillow of her bed. "Am I as fearful as those people whose hearts beat with terror every time they hear the mention of ghosts?" And closing her eyes, she made another effort to go back to sleep, but that effort was in vain. She soon got back out of bed, even more pale and nervous, even more afraid. There was no longer any doubt. The brocade curtains of her doorway had separated, and she could hear the sound of measured footsteps moving over the carpet. The noise of those steps was soft and indistinct, but it continued, and she could also hear a scraping sound, like wood or bone. And it came closer and closer until she heard something move the prayer stool at the foot of her bed. Beatrice uttered a sharp cry. She ducked her head under the covers and held her breath. The wind rattled the windows of her balcony. The falling water of a distant fountain continued splashing monotonously. The sound of barking dogs was carried by the wind, and the bells of the city of Soria, some near, some far away, continued tolling for the souls of the dead. In this way an hour passed, then two, then the entire night, which seemed endless to Beatrice. Finally, day began to dawn. Recovering from her fear, she opened her eyes to the first rays of light. After a night of insomnia and fear, the bright light of day was a wondrous thing. She pushed back the silk covers of her bed and cast her eyes over her surroundings, ready to laugh at her fear. But suddenly, a cold chill spread over her body. A pallor covered her cheeks, and her eyes bulged as she stared at the torn blue sash covered with blood that was draped over the prayer stool at the foot of her bed. It was the sash she had lost on the mountain, which Alonso had gone to find. The next morning, when her mortified servants came to inform her that the son of Count Alcuriel was dead, that his body had been discovered on the Mountain of Souls where it had been devoured by wolves, they found Beatrice motionless and stiff, with both hands clinging to the ebony bedposts, her eyes bulging, her mouth open, her lips white. Her heart had stopped beating, and she had died of fright. 4. They say that, sometime after this happened, a hunter became lost and was forced to spend the night on the Mountain of Souls. Before he died the following day, he was able to describe what he had seen. He insisted that he saw the ghosts of the Templars and the Knights of Soria rise out of their tombs in the chapel at the time of prayers. Then, he saw them mount their skeletal horses, and they began to pursue a beautiful woman, pale and disheveled, whose feet were bare and bloody, and who uttered cries of terror as she ran around and around the tomb of Alonso. What did you think of these classic horror stories? Comment or email redtreehousepod@gmail.com. As we turn down the lights on this episode, make plans to join me next time as we continue celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm your host, Will. Thanks for joining me in the Red Treehouse.